Welcome to Talk+Water, the podcast that takes a deep dive into the world of water with those making waves. My name is Todd Votteler, and I'm your host for Talk+Water. I'm also the editor-in-chief of Texas+Water and the Texas+Water Journal. You can sign up for Texas+Water by visiting texas+water.org. And you can sign up for the Texas+Water Journal at texas+waterjournal.org. Both publications are free. This is podcast number 19. My guest today is Dr. Larry Stevens, the director of the Springs Stewardship Institute. Larry, welcome, and thank you for being part of Talk+Water.
Thanks, Todd, for the opportunity to be here today.
So let's start out with your background in water. How did you first become involved with water issues?
I come from a generation I come from northern New Hampshire originally. My family's got 13 generations up there. At the age of 4, I fell into my first spring. And it's been a love affair with water and springs ever since, although that was a kind of a cold March morning as we were making maple syrup up there in the North Woods. I've had a long-term fascination with water, its relationship to life, both flowing water and standing water, worked on many issues related to river regulation, reservoir ecology, and gradually began to focus on springs because they have so many dimensions that matter to society, to the science of ecology, and to evolution.
So now you have gone from the Northeast and you're in the Southwest down in Arizona. So tell me about the Springs Stewardship Institute. I met you just about, I guess, a month ago at the Nevada Water Resource Association where we were both speaking. And I have to tell you, I was shocked that I did not know about your organization because I have been so interested in springs, going back to my time working on Comal and San Marcos Springs at the Edwards Aquifer, that when I saw your presentation, I was like, I want to know all about this organization.
Well, we started Springs Stewardship Institute here at the Museum of Northern Arizona in 2012 in response to a number of our interests in the ecology of springs and to try to bring more attention to the conservation needs of springs globally. So this is a global initiative from the nonprofit Museum of Northern Arizona's Springs Stewardship Institute, and we use this as a very positive science and neutral otherwise institution. So we're about science, and we're about encouragement for balancing the ecological values of springs along with their use. There's no humans have been using springs forever throughout our entire history, and there's no restriction on we have no expectation that humans won't use springs, but we see a big need for being able to balance the ecology of springs with the uses. And so beginning in 2012, we began to do workshops and bring trainings to individuals and organizations interested in that. And since that time, our website and our Springs Online database have really grown in use. We now have more than 1,000 users on Springs Online, which is the database component of our program. And we are looking at a wide array of springs, mostly focused in North America so far, but ours is a global initiative, and we hope to be able to move out into the rest of the world with this as time goes on.
So you mentioned some of the outreach that you're doing. Do you have any other programs there at the Institute regarding springs?
Yeah, so we realize that we have to take a kind of level approach to this topic because springs are so under-recognized. So a lot of the work we do is approaching organizations that manage springs. These are federal agencies, Native American tribes, some states, organizations that manage a lot of springs, and we provide them with inventory and ecological assessment tools. We do that kind of work for them. Great science to be had there because oftentimes we're kind of the first scientists on the scene with many of these sites that they just haven't been visited before. Great adventure in doing the field inventory work. But our real purpose is to provide advisement to the stewards of these springs, whether they be agencies, tribes, or even private individuals. And in that light, we do workshops and trainings. We've done in the last couple of years, we've done trainings throughout Western North America, in the United States, in Mexico, and Canada. And right now we're involved with some programs that are involving citizen scientists and adventure scientists and going out and doing recon and evaluation of springs. So we do trainings to provide information back to the stewards and help improve then the management of the springs.
So I want to follow up on something you just mentioned at the beginning of your answer about springs being under-recognized. I mean, that's something that I've really been curious about because I've been thinking about that for a while. You probably seen Gunnar Brun's Springs of Texas book, and I read that 25 years ago, I guess now, and started thinking about I'm involved in water management here in Texas, and a lot of the discussions about ecological impacts, but we're talking about rivers and bays and estuaries and wetlands, but it seems like we rarely talk about springs. And so, it seems like that is kind of a significant issue with springs, that they're somewhat overlooked in the water conversation.
Well, I would say more than somewhat overlooked. They're really dramatically overlooked. I'm Googling, Todd, right now on the word spring, and the first thing that comes up is a advertisement for some kind of information management system. Spring makes Java reactive.
Oh, that's funny. I did that, and I got metal springs.
Right. Yeah. The second is auto parts. So the real problem is in English is homography. I think one of the key problems is that there are so many meanings for the word spring. They're all related meanings, but they don't get you to the water feature. And so it's not until you get maybe sometimes on the second page of Google that you even see water mentioned in relation to springs. The point is that English might not be a very good language for talking about springs because we have so much confusion in the language about it. If you go to Spanish, if you go to Spanish or French, where there's a single word for spring, then that makes a lot more sense. Manantial in Spanish, source in French. So we have a limitation on our language about approaching the topic of springs, and that's not all. But that problem kind of works its way through the entire process of public attention to them, to scientific attention to them, to funding dedicated to them, and possibly even to our water law policy. It's just that they're just not recognized in the English language very well. Everywhere else in the world, springs are regarded as places where miracles happen, places where that are just remarkably important for human well-being and biodiversity. So this issue of bringing springs into the public attention is kind of a big deal in our culture. There are many other kind of implications of it. Most of the work on wetlands, on water resources, on the effects of climate change, on these critical resources, do not even mention springs. I can't tell you the number of books I've read through searching even for the word spring to be mentioned anywhere in them. The concept is just not there. People don't recognize it, and part of that goes into our water policy, at least in the Western U.S., in Texas as well. I think you've got appropriative water rights. Groundwater, surface water are two very different legal topics, and springs are right at the intersection between the two. Springs kind of legally fall between the cracks of our legal system.
Right.
So that's a very important issue because of the high conservation value, the high economic and social societal value of springs. We don't have a mechanism to recognize them in our language.
Right. And just going back to, talking about the law and springs in Texas, when I first became involved in the Edwards-Aquifer issues, I would talk to people about the legal journey that a drop of water goes on. And if you can imagine, a drop of water falls on the ground in Texas in the contributing zone of the Edwards-Aquifer, then enters into a stream course where it's now publicly owned water. And the state of Texas can give you a right to divert and use it. And then when that drop of water flows over the Edwards-Aquifer recharge zone and entered into the aquifer, it was subject to the rule of capture. So it was private property and was not owned by the state. But when it eventually came out of Comal or San Marcos or one of the other springs, as it saw the light coming out of the spring, it was magically transformed back into publicly owned surface water again, for which the state may have issued permits based on downstream at that point, based on the flow of those springs, which were not, protected or guaranteed because they weren't regulated and were subject to the rule of capture, which means the law of the biggest pump, and you can keep on pumping when you drive your neighbor's well or a local spring. So, well, let's actually move to a little bit about springs themselves physically. I was just thinking about this. We have springs actually underwater, even under the sea, and so they're actually, are there a number of different types of springs that you find all over the world, and do we have any kind of a sense of how many springs there might be globally? And what do you think?
Great questions. The limitations of our knowledge have to do with mapping and the geography of springs, which here in the U.S., if you look on a U.S. geological map, 1 to 24,000 scale, you can see little squiggles. Unfortunately, those squiggles are not searchable yet because the direction of the squiggle shows you where the water is flowing. And that's a mapping constraint that it doesn't allow us to actually tally the springs of the United States very easily. Springs are, as you say, abundant all over the world, even on the floor of the ocean. Springs recycle all the water on Earth every 8 to 10 million years through deep sea vent and tectonic groundwater flow into the crust, and then coming back out in these very hot, super pressurized springs on the seafloor.
With the black smokers, or is that what those are called?
Yes, several different morphologies of springs. I'm not sure how good the classification of springs on the floor of the ocean is. That seems to be mostly the purview of Woods Hole Biological Station, and trying to interact with them to find out more about how they classify their deep sea springs. But there are also cold water seeps and springs on the floor of the ocean, which have gotten very little attention, but also have a very unique fauna and geochemistry. So springs are found throughout the world. Most springs are small. The big, beautiful springs like Comal and Devil's River, and those systems are spectacular. They get a lot of attention, but most springs are quite tiny, 500 square meters or so on average. Doing a calculation based on what we have in North America, data we have in North America so far, and extrapolating that to the rest of the world, whether that's a fair extrapolation or not, there appear to be at least 2.5 million springs on Earth. People have estimated more than 20-fold more than that, but not actually based on calculations of spring area. And even today, most people are not measuring the size of the springs, the spring-affected habitat. Groundwater's coming out, affecting a patch of land. How big is that patch of land? That's those calculations are often not being done. So we're trying to gather data on that to be able to make this some of these estimations. But 2.5, 3 million springs on Earth at least, and perhaps an order of magnitude more. As we learn more, we'll be able to refine that estimate. You also asked about the classification of springs.
Yes.
Abe Springer and I in 2009, and then in a paper that's just coming out in Ecological Applications now, recognized 13 major types of springs, of terrestrial springs, meaning springs that are coming out on continental surfaces. Many of them do come out underwater, under freshwater rivers and lakes and whatnot. But nonetheless, about 13 different types of springs emerge on the Earth's continents, and we've tested this in Australia, in Europe, in North Africa, as well as North America, and South America. So we have a pretty good sense that we've got most of the types of springs captured in this research. There are about another half dozen subtypes of springs, because, say, a marshy spring can come out on the banks of a river and be subject to flooding disturbance, and that changes the entire character of the spring as an ecosystem. So these 13 major types are ecosystem types. In looking at that classification system, we've come to the conclusion that springs really should be regarded as a biome of Earth. These spring systems are so distinctive; they're all linked by the emergence of groundwater and the linkage between the underworld, if you will, and the atmosphere. Those are key kind of connecting features of springs that allow us to identify springs as really being an Earth biome.
So when I first became involved with springs, of course, I thought, well, it's one opening. But, there, for most, I guess, large spring systems, there are multiple openings. There's just a lot of fractures in the rock in various places. And so it's very different than I first was thinking about their, kind of morphology.
Yeah. Many springs come out in several sources, sometimes very close springs come out in many springs come out in multiple sources. Some of those sources are directly connected, so we're comfortable calling that a springs ecosystem. Notice I'm using the word springs as a plural there, because it's very unusual to find a single vent. In other landscapes, there are multiple springs that are not necessarily directly connected to each other. Happy to call each of those a springs ecosystem in its own right, but they are in provinces or in fairly close proximity. I was talking with an Australian spring ecologist yesterday, and he talked about Elizabeth Spring in Queensland, which has more than 700 springs that are pretty closely related. So they haven't bothered to try to name any of those. They just give them numbers. And hopefully their GPS tracking system is accurate enough to be able to revisit those numbered sources. It's a very common misconception that spring sources move. It's not the norm that they do, because where the springs are coming out is usually geologically controlled. Faults and fractures are allowing the water to come to the surface, and the tilt on the aquifer allows the water to be coming out through gravity or sometimes under pressure if it's a confined aquifer. Nonetheless, the sources don't generally move very much. There are some situations in which seasonal increases in the groundwater level table. There are situations in which the groundwater table can rise and the spring source can move upslope slightly, but those are generally kind of rare. Mostly it's geological control of the sources.
So what is it about Nevada? When you gave your presentation, it seemed like there's really a lot of springs in Nevada for some reason.
We've been really delighted to be able to work in the state of Nevada because it has such a fabulous array of landforms. There are 1,000 mountain ranges in that basin and range province, places where the crust of the earth has been actually kind of slightly pulled apart and transformed into Horst and Graben mountain ranges. And when you do that to the crust of the earth, aquifers are layers of rock that are fractured and able to hold water in those fractures. If you tilt those bodies of rock, the aquifers, and allow the water will then pass by gravity and to a place where the aquifer is exposed to the Earth's surface. That's where springs come out. So we've estimated now 27,000 springs in Nevada. It's the highest concentration of springs in any state so far, and that's interesting because Nevada is also the driest state. So that contrast of aridity plus a great number of springs means springs are super important as water sources there. Also, quite interesting is that because the springs come out in these desert landscapes, they create a spring brook that flows for some distance, 10 meters, 100 meters, sometimes a kilometer, and then sinks back into the earth. So those waters are never recorded in stream flow gauges, or very rarely are they recorded. That makes the amount of water coming out quite provocative. I think we estimated 250,000 acre-feet of water based on the data we have for Nevada so far, 250,000 acre-feet of water a year coming out in those in the state that is probably not recorded on any of their stream flow gauges.
And so, you mentioned a little about how, you've got so many different types of springs. I imagine that I know that they are biological diversity hotspots. If you look at the Evers Aquifer and the springs associated with that aquifer, most of those large spring systems have, endemic species. And, there are a lot of species that are listed as endangered or threatened that are in those various springs. And so I imagine that they really are very, very important in terms of biological diversity.
Yeah, springs are biological hotspots in ways that we don't really think about because many of the creatures that we encounter at springs aren't very well known, aren't recognized. Some of them haven't even been described to science. We did a project 3 years ago where we looked at all the springs from Death Valley to south central Texas, and tallied the number of springs that had been reported in that landscape, and then compiled information on the springs-dependent species that live in that landscape. The Europeans call those crenobiotes. That's a very impoetic word, so we prefer springs-dependent species as a way to describe these creatures. For the 50,000 springs we had reported in that landscape, a huge landscape across the desert Southwest, we came up with at least 1,200 species of plants, invertebrates, and vertebrates, macro species. We haven't looked at the microbial biology of these systems very much yet, but 1,200 species were springs dependent in that landscape. In some cases, the springs are hosting an entirely different flora and fauna than exists in the surrounding landscape in many of those states and settings. So the biodiversity of springs can be extremely high, and the kinds of species that live at springs are often very precisely adapted to the water chemistry, to the temperature, to the constancy of the environment. And in many cases, we find endemic species that are found at just 1 or 2 or 3 springs, for example. All across the desert Southwest, we have spring snails, which are little tiny, very elegant little snails that are about 200 species in North America. Most of them are restricted to just a few springs. And so we have this very high level of endemism within this one family of snails that we've happened to look at. Part of the story there is that the researcher working on these things was willing to spend his entire life dissecting the reproductive tracts of these little tiny snails and then doing the genetics on them and being able to tie those two parts of the story together. Morphology and genetics vary enough for him to describe. He described more than 100 species in his career of these spring snails. So that's one example, but we haven't looked at several other families of snails and other mollusks that live in these sites. Finger clams, phycid snails. The doors are wide open on how many species we have with there. It's probably hundreds more species of mollusks that occur in springs there that we haven't taxonomically described yet. So biodiversity hotspot, yes. unknowns and mysteries remaining off the charts. Springs are just fabulously ecologically diverse in these desert settings. At higher elevations where the springs are shaded, oftentimes the productivity is lower, not so many unique species. But again, we haven't really looked at much of the actual genetics on things like stoneflies and mayflies that are living in these cold water, often shaded sites. So we don't really know what the biodiversity is going on at those sites either. We call this intrinsic or point source biodiversity that we have going on in a lot of our springs here in the Southwest. And the focus has been on the aquatic species, but there are also wetland and there are riparian species living in these settings that we have not really looked at very much. Beetles, quite a large number of ground beetles live around springs. They haven't been looked at. Spiders, etc. Lots and lots more to learn there. So it's really a wide open field, and there's a huge open invitation to anybody interested in biology and taxonomy to get involved in these relationships.
That sounds like a call to graduate students.
It is absolutely a call. The many dimensions of ecological intrigue and evolutionary intrigue to be searched for in springs is just off the charts. It's just a fabulous environment to be able to think about a career in that field. I wanted to say that, so we have all this intrinsic biodiversity at springs, but springs are also playing an enormous role in the landscapes in which they exist. In many cases, springs are very isolated. Maybe there's no other water around for 10 kilometers. And that, there may be no other water in a 10-kilometer radius around the springs. That means that every bird in the landscape pretty much has to come to that spring to water every day. Doves, you name it, quail and whatnot. They're all coming in for that water source, and therefore the ecological interactivity with the surrounding landscape can be incredibly important. The loss of that spring means those species are actually out of water. They don't have a source of water in those landscapes. I've had as many as 35 species of birds show up in half an hour at one spring. We're looking at an isolated spring here in northern Arizona. So springs are functioning as keystone ecosystems. Lots of interactivity with the surrounding landscape, lots of interchange from the surrounding landscape into the spring, from the spring out into the surrounding landscape, from the spring up into the atmosphere, from the spring probably down into the hyporheic zone, the zone of saturated channel down below the floor of the spring. Many different dimensions of interactivity going on there. So again, this makes springs just very, very interesting and intriguing and complex landscapes to be able to try to figure out as ecosystems.
So in addition to being biological diversity hotspots, I know that there are also archaeological hotspots. Texas State University, you go to San Marcos Springs, they have an underwater archaeology program, trying to piece together occupation of those springs going back, it seems like it's at least 12,000 years. They've been used by humans constantly. And so I'm interested in the, viewpoint of archaeology. What are springs revealing about our past?
Very deep question. There was a very provocative paper in 2014 by two authors, Cuthbert and Ashley, who reconstructed the hydrology of the Olduvai Gorge. This is where our oldest human ancestors are found. And what they found was that the human remains were found at springs, in the vicinity of springs. Their explanation was that during droughts in that period of time, 3 million years ago, humans would retreat to the springs because of the reliability of the water there. The rest of the landscape might dry up, and the springs are the only source of water. Well, there's another side to that story. They didn't go into too much, but what we're finding is that springs are also ambush sites for large predators. The large predators come into those sites and wait. They may wait on the periphery, they may wait inside the spring, depending on the vegetation and whatnot, but then they attack prey that are coming for water. And So another kind of side of the human remains left at springs, maybe that's where large predators were attacking our ancestors. Very provocative paper, but it ties springs very intimately to our own evolution. In more recent time, Pleistocene times, most of the Pleistocene kill sites with these earliest North American Paleo-Indians were attacking their prey were at springs. I think of Mammoth Hot Springs. We think of a number of sites studied by Vance Haynes, who looked at mammoth kill sites and camel kill sites all across the United States, from Nevada over into Florida even. So at a number of places we find, Pleistocene megafauna with cut marks on them, showing that humans had actually laid in wait at these springs and taken them down. So very important in terms of our human history here in North America. In more recent times, the more modern cultures of Indians have developed pretty elaborate not mythology, it's belief systems about the origination of springs and the divine beings associated with springs, and there's kind of an elaborate dialogue about that topic. Again, springs are often viewed as sacred sites, as remarkably influential places where miracles happen and whatnot in many other cultures except our own. So there's a long-term role of springs in human culture and evolutionary history. And one hypothesis that I'm kicking around a bit these days is that initially in hunting-gathering settings, situations, pre-agricultural situations, springs are used as ambush sites. But as the game are killed off and the need for agriculture arises, then springs become places where people live. Prior to agriculture, people probably didn't live at springs so much because A, big predators were coming in, and B, you would scare the prey away if you lived there. But in agricultural times, then using the water from the spring to grow crops would be a more important kind of function. So there may be a hypothesis to be tested. If any of our audience are anthropologically inclined, that might be something really interesting to look at across the world.
Well, so from hunting spots to agricultural centers to tourism, springs, especially in West Texas, places like that, used to be sites of tourism. I don't know if you've heard, there's an effort to bring back Comanche Springs in Texas, which was a spot on the way to El Paso and I guess further west that people used to be able to stop and swim in the springs there. And, that's not the only example of that. It seems like there was a real interest in going to springs and hot springs, and I guess in particular at one point in time, and rejuvenating yourself, and they were, I guess, a big part of leisure time in America at one time.
Yeah, so the role of springs in our history is pretty rich when you start to get into it. The old Spanish Trail goes from water source to water source. Most of those are springs across the Southwest. Many of the train routes and the wagon train routes, and eventually the railroads are coming to places that have water to be able to provide water for steam and the steam engines and whatnot. Very rich history there, and it's very interesting way to tie the local landscape into the present day societal state, if you will. The recreational use of springs, long-term interest in that. The hot springs of the United States have been studied, since about 1900 by the U.S. Geological Survey, and there's every state has a hot springs of Texas, of whatever state you're in. Lots of attention there. And so, in fact, so much attention that it's kind of hard to find hot springs that are in a natural situation where you can actually study their ecology. So we go to Yellowstone National Park or some of our national parks to look at unmanipulated hot springs, but they're quite rare now. The economic value of those has never been assessed. It's probably enormous. One place where we do have some insight into the economic value of springs, because that's a lot of what our society focuses on, is Florida. And there have been some studies there. Bond and Bell, 2002, looked at 4 of the large pool-forming springs, finding that those springs brought in 2 million visitors per year and added $60 million in revenue to the local economies. So 4 springs can bring in that much attention. In other settings in another mode, springs are often used for bottling water. And if you go out and look at the grocery store, the number of bottled water products you find there, many of them are labeled as springs water. And so what often the companies do is go out near a spring, sink a well in, pull the water out, bottle it, and then sell that to you at kind of a very steep cost. Well, that industry has grown to the point where Americans are drinking at least 50 million bottles of water per day, much of it labeled as springs water, an industry of well in excess of $12 to $15 billion a year just in the U.S. And this is going on worldwide. It's got to the point where oftentimes it's hard. I think the younger generation may not recognize where their water's coming from. Oh, it comes from bottles. Yeah. Yeah. It's unfortunate, but the economic value of springs water has always been recognized, but it is just off the charts in terms of local economies and now international economy.
Well, you've seen a lot of controversy over bottling companies setting up in different aquifers, and people get very concerned about the impact of their aquifers. And I was just thinking about what you're talking about, how many of those bottled water companies, say spring water, when I'm not sure that they all are spring water, let's put it that way. It's spring, adding springs on there probably adds to the value of the product, I think.
Yeah, marketing is everything, of course.
Right.
And many of the bottled water companies don't say spring on them. They're probably taking tap. Who knows what they're doing?
Right.
But many are very proud of the fact that they're using some version of spring water. Again, it might be a groundwater taken out from a well near a spring, but enough to call it the part of that spring. The damage, of course, the drawdown of groundwater is that we can dewater the spring, and this has happened many, many times. So that means the loss of the spring and the spring's ecosystem.
So what kind of information do you have at the Springs Stewardship Institute? And is it mostly confined to the United States, or are you looking for information all over the world about springs? Tell us a little bit about that.
The Springs Stewardship Institute has 2 main portals. One is our website, springstewardshipinstitute.org, and that provides background information, inventory and assessment protocols, information about some of the projects we've taken up, and a bibliography on springs that we are expanding to the entire world. So it's a pretty vast resource for information about springs. The other is called Springs Online. That's springsdata.org, not springsdata.com, but springsdata.org. And that is a site that stores information on springs. It's freely available. Anybody wanting to archive information about springs are welcome to. It's password protected, so your information is secure. We recommend that people use that to be able to initiate discussions with landowners. Aquifers don't necessarily have the political boundaries that we apply to the surface, and therefore neighbors in different states, neighboring agencies, private versus agency folks might want to talk to each other about springs. Springs Online provides the ability to do that. It's a brilliantly constructed information management system created by Jerry Ledbetter here at Springs Stewardship Institute. and it's being used now by more than 1,000 users across North America, from Mexico to Canada. Our intent is to expand this to the world. We're engaging in a NSF proposal to increase the number of languages that the database is constructed in, so that you can choose your language and therefore be able to load information on springs for any country in the world. This is a complicated process, of course, we hope to get to this in the next year or so, year and a half. Well, so our outreach is to anyone in the world who wants to learn more about springs. We interact with quite a few researchers in Australia, in Western Europe, Central Europe, and the UK. We're reaching out to anybody who wants to learn more about it. We're particularly looking for collaborators in South America and Africa. Those are continents for which there's not very much information available so far. But again, our scope is international, even though we're right now building our program in North America. But the issues facing the conservation of springs are definitely global in scope. Every continent on the planet has springs-related issues. Probably even Antarctica, although we haven't been down there yet. But certainly in every arid land region, springs are being very heavily overdrawn, and they're being managed in a way that just doesn't recognize the ecological relevance of these to the whole landscape and their importance to the health of whole landscapes.
So, of course, I'm familiar with the litigation over the Texas Edwards Aquifer and its springs. But as you mentioned, springs are sources of that kind of environmental / water conflict all over the world. Any other, current disputes over springs that are rising to the top that you might want to mention?
Well, certainly the situation at Devil's Hole in Nevada is an important one to mention. Devil's Hole is a small exposure spring that this is a place where the surface of the groundwater is exposed through a geologic crack in the earth, and it hosts several endemic species: a pupfish, Devil's Hole pupfish, an endemic water beetle. Very tight food web of these endemic species there. Devil's Hole is actually owned by Death Valley National Park, so it's an in-holding of Death Valley National Park in Nevada, southern Nevada, and it's one of the most heavily litigated springs in Nevada, and certainly the Southwest, because the endangered fish breeds on a surface of rock that's 10 to 20 centimeters below the surface, and if the groundwater table drops below that slab of rock, the fish will not have breeding habitat. And there are very few of these fish, fewer than 350 fish in this one setting. And so a drop in that water table could actually eliminate that endangered species. Very heavily litigated site that protects the groundwater basin in pretty much all of southern Nevada there. So it's a very heavily litigated site, and quite an important benchmark for protecting groundwater. Let me just say that there's lots and lots of controversy about how we should be managing groundwater. Some are of the opinion that we should just suck it all dry and then leave the next generation with literally no groundwater. That is certainly a theme in the Midwest, in the Ogallala Aquifer, for example. Pump it dry. This is not very farsighted. If we have, we want our children to be able to have access to groundwater, and the premise that we can tap out groundwater and it will somehow magically get water from someplace else is completely flawed. These are limited resources. Some of the water we're tapping out in these aquifers are Pleistocene in age. In some cases, some of the groundwaters on Earth are 1 million years old, and if you, as in Australia, where they've gone through lots of litigation about springs as well. So they recognize that you can't We need to leave our water for future generations, for the well-being of our society, of our nations, and all the life that exists there. So, protecting groundwater for both our natural heritage and the well-being of society is a major theme. It should be a major governmental theme in all arid landscapes, at least, if not everywhere on Earth.
Well, that leads me into my last question for you. And are there local, state, federal, or international programs that you're aware of that are specifically focused on protecting springs?
Again, attention to springs is problematic because springs are not generally recognized. They fall between the legal cracks of groundwater and surface water legislation. At a local level, our city here in Flagstaff is paying great attention to springs. They've actually done a couple of restoration projects on springs that are critical to the history and well-being of our town. Many of the cities and towns in the Southwest are sinking wells because they have not enough surface water to supply their needs. And the places where groundwater depletion is going on is often a very local kind of phenomenon, where we draw a water table down and then people in the region have to either sink deeper wells or figure out some other source of water. So there are many local problems developing around the world. At the state level here in the United States, several states have really excellent programs for monitoring and paying attention to springs. The Edwards Aquifer is very heavily monitored. Very great amount of attention going to making sure that you don't run out of water there. In Florida, a state program to look at the more than 1,000 springs that are recognized as recreational and economic hotspots in the landscape there. So Florida has a really good program. Texas is doing quite well. Nevada now has a pretty good program in terms of inventorying and assessing its springs and springs-dependent species. California's made some steps forward, but those are the kind of prime examples. I don't think there's not a reliable map of the springs of Alaska where there could easily be 1 million springs for all we know. Many big suites of springs are not recognized. The prairie potholes, for example, are exposures of groundwater. That's what a spring is. And there are who knows how many hundreds of thousands of prairie potholes, of which 90% are gone. 90% have been eliminated, and yet the remaining 10% are producing half of the waterfowl in North America. So, again, springs are really important as ecological and biodiversity hotspots. They're also under major threat from human activities.
That's interesting what you just mentioned. Because I'm aware of the programs and all the various efforts to conserve prairie pothole wetlands, but I never hear as part of that anything having to do with conserving groundwater connected to those potholes.
Yeah, at national levels, excuse me, among nations, several nations are doing a good job of protecting springs. Norway, Australia have major programs to protect their springs, but most nations do not. United States, it's just kind of an open issue because it's left to the individual states to manage their groundwater, and our definition of wetlands precludes consideration of groundwater. So there's a major hurdle in the United States because we don't formally, legally recognize the connection between groundwater and surface water, and therefore we don't protect springs on a national scale. Many springs are protected as state parks throughout Texas, all across the nation. Some countries are doing a really remarkable job of understanding and recognizing the importance of their springs. The European Union recognizes one kind of spring, travertine-forming springs, as worthy of protection. So those get some attention. But otherwise, springs are not universally recognized by the European Union. Lots more of attention could be paid there. there, just as here in North America, springs are playing very important roles in biodiversity.
I would encourage people to, if they're interested in seeing what a plan to conserve springs and, conserve an aquifer looks like, to take a look at the Edwards Aquifer Habitat Conservation Plan, which was developed by a stakeholder process that took over 7 years. And so that give you some idea of some of the things that can be done. So, Larry, once again, thank you for being with me today, talk about springs. I know you've given this out a couple of times already, but can you give us the website again and the site for the database so that our listeners can find those?
Sure, Todd. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you today. Our website is Springs Stewardship Institute, all one word, .org, SpringsStewardshipInstitute.org. And the portal for archiving and analysis of Springs data is called springsdata.org. We call it Springs Online, the Springs Online database, springsdata.org. And if anyone has interest in signing up for an account, has Springs information they'd like to archive there, they're most welcome to do so. We have operators standing by during the Arizona working hours and ready to help anybody who has any problem with or wants to do an analysis that they are interested in. Again, the information is password protected, so you can't see all the data unless you have clearance for some of these landscapes. Some organizations like the tribes want to keep their data protected. Some endangered species issues are sensitive enough that that information is protected. Nonetheless, springsdata.org is a portal for being able to archive and analyze data on springs. And I think springs are remarkably complex environments. They are multidimensional in the kinds of information that they contain, and we haven't even thought of the kinds of questions that will eventually may be asked about springs. Relationships between water chemistry and the distribution of plants across elevation and aspect, for example. These become questions we can address scientifically. We haven't had a mechanism to be able to even tackle those questions yet. And as we populate this database, now we've got about 5,000 springs surveys in it from all around the country and around North America. These kinds of questions become addressable. So if people are interested in adding data to this system, they're most welcome to, and we can help you with that. Springsdata.org and SpringsStewardshipInstitute.org.
Great. Thanks, Larry. I really enjoyed this conversation, learning about springs. And, I hope that springs are going to get a lot more attention going forward. I know that, there are efforts here in Texas that are refocusing on springs. And I'm sure that the Springs Stewardship Institute is going to be right in the middle of the efforts nationwide, maybe worldwide, to conserve springs.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Todd. It was really a pleasure to talk with you.
So this has been Talk+Water. My guest today was Larry Stevens, the director of the Springs Stewardship Institute. My name is Todd Votteler, the host of Talk+Water. Let's talk water again soon.